as you know, Bob and Mark have stated, what was really excited me is first and foremost the people that we've got here. You know, I know a lot of the people involved and been around footy circles a long time, and then I sort of went through the playing list and looked at that, at how exciting it is. You know, I think 80% of our first premiership side is sitting in this room right now. You know, there'll be a few bits added along the way, but the fact of the matter is this side and this club are very capable of saluting in the not-too-distant future. So,
what a weekend it's been in AFL football. I'm your co-host, Brody Burrows. With me, as always, is Juri Bilcic. Mate, how's your head after the weekend? Because mine's about to explode here in South Australia.
Brody, great to have a chat with you as always for another captivating week. And, it has been an absolute whirlwind, hasn't it, once more? And Damien Hardwick's announcement on the 6-year deal to be the next Gold Coast Suns head coach, which is arguably their biggest signing ever in club history since they entered the competition all the way back in 2011. And, of course, we'll get to that absolutely debacle, diabolical, non-goal controversy, which robbed Adelaide of any hope of being part of September action, considering they have a pretty, you could call it straightforward game against West Coast if you want that way, if they had have beaten Sydney last Saturday night. But unfortunately, it's one that the AFL for too many times have got to answer to once more. And we've seen for, I'd say, at least a good 4 or 5 years where just too many of these straightforward non-goals that aren't called and come under controversial circumstances haunt a team. So, yeah, plenty to get through and dissect, and can't wait to do it all with you.
We'll start off with the game on Friday night. It was Brisbane 124 defeating Collingwood 100. And I think in this game, Lachie Neale showed the exact reason why he's going to be copying a very tight tag throughout the whole final series, mate.
Yeah, we did see that right with Tom Mitchell going on to him, but I think ultimately Neale shrugged it off, and I think that's where the difference really came, because Tom Mitchell isn't a tagger by any means whatsoever, and I think it was just a ploy that I think Craig McRae wanted to use to try and just get that extra physical body to run around with Lachie Neale, and we saw the Gold Coast Suns do that with Touk Miller, and it worked effectively because Touk's a far more of an endurance runner than what Tom Mitchell is. Yeah. He can keep up with Neale. He can run him off his feet. But it was the complete opposite last Friday night, Brody. He was the one that was running Mitchell around ragged in contests, hurting him on the outside. There was that brilliant play in the third quarter where I think he spun past a Collingwood player, faked a handball and launched it deep inside Brisbane's attacking 50, which ultimately ended up being a behind. But it's that sort of play alone where unfortunately, Collingwood didn't have that other option to quell Lachie Neale's influence at the time. And I think what didn't help Collingwood whatsoever was losing Nathan Murphy as well, who won't be available tomorrow night for the clash against the Bombers. And, yeah, once he went down, their backline, of course, being without Darcy Moore for at least another week with a hamstring injury, became paper thin. And it just ultimately sort of led to more seeping cracks being opened up in the Collingwood defence. And unfortunately, they couldn't stop the Brisbane Lions surge, which everyone knows they're one of the top 2 scoring sides in the game. And it just went from there. And unfortunately, it sort of has been a bit of a recurring theme for the last month with the Magpies that they've leaked more points, at least 35 to 40 more points than what they did in, the first 18, 19 rounds of the season.
Yeah, you just mentioned that. In the last 4 games alone, they're 18th in points against, higher than West Coast, higher than Essendon, who had 168 scored against them on the weekend. I don't know about you, but I'm a little bit worried about Collingwood coming into the finals. Yes, Darcy Moore's going to be coming back. Yes, Nick Dacos maybe prelim, maybe earlier, who knows. But there's nothing like finals pressure. And you go from a minor round, coming back from an injury, straight into finals pressure. I mean, I think Darcy Moore will be fine. I think they're being careful with him. But I'm a little bit worried about Collingwood coming straight back into finals pressure when the tackling's going to be on. And we've seen Collingwood love to run, and finals type, it's a whole different ball game, and you never know if that kind of footy's going to hold up. I'm a little bit worried about him at this stage.
Well, I think we saw last year, Brody, that their best does hold up in finals anyway. So I'm not overly concerned in that regard, because we saw against Geelong last year when they were able to get out in space and use the exquisite kicking skills and the Lincoln handball chains through the middle of the ground, that they worried Geelong. And I think I may be wrong on this side, but I think if Collingwood had have beaten Geelong and if Geelong have met them in the grand final, the Magpies will have won that contest. In all honesty, just the way they were tracking at the time, they were basically unstoppable at the time. And of course, they had nothing to lose at that point last season. So again, I don't see too much of a grey area at this stage. Yes, 4 games is enough of a sample, shall I say? But once I think Moore gets back as well from that hamstring and Dacos, and I think yet again just the forward line as well. We've seen there was that period of time there where they didn't quite fire, but we saw Brody Mychek fire a few weeks ago too. So I think just the way it's all going at the moment, and people will probably reach their assumptions that, they may be too late to turn their season around, but I only have to, once more, looking back to last season, just to look at the whole picture and see that their best footy does stack up in finals, Brody.
Yeah, I'm a little bit worried because I think the Port Adelaide, it's not going to be a Geelong where they can get out. You know, if you look at Melbourne, you look at Port Adelaide, and you look at Brisbane, they're just as quick through the midfield and off half back as them. Whereas last year, you sort of look at Geelong, and that's where they really got a hold of Geelong, was their speed. And if Geelong had one weakness last year, that's what it was. You could see, they were just contested beasts. They're always going to beat people up on the inside. But if you're going to get a hold of Geelong, you're going to get a hold of them on the outside. But who knows coming into this last round anyway. We've got Richmond 101 defeating North Melbourne 72. Cochin and Rewalt last game at the MCG. And for me, I reckon Harry Sheasel just won himself the rising star with that performance.
Yeah, that was another, phenomenal performance. 1 in 23, isn't it, this season? He's produced every week, Brody. I think
just about
38 touches or 40 touches in total. It was an incredible performance yet again from a guy who just makes the game look so easy in his first year. And people spoke about Nick Dacos last year, right? And how he basically averaged, 28, 29 disposals a game his first season alone. It was just phenomenal. And now what we've already seen with him from his first game against West Coast, and I think it's just those players, Brody, where, and this is cliche, that the superstar players of the game always seem to have time and space, no matter whether it's in the finer congestion or whether it's just that little bit of space on the outer. And I think that's something he does exceptionally well. Where North Melbourne this stage, for the next couple, whatever how many seasons it takes for them to rebuild that list back into a finals contender and then back into a premiership contender, that's where him and George Wardlaw, and we can name the rest of the names there at the footy club, that are going to be the next nucleus for North Melbourne's next premiership team. Of course, the last time they did win that flag was back in 1999. But again, for Richmond too, to farewell both two legends of the club, Jack Riewoldt, Trent Cotchin, both such instrumental architects of those 3 flags as well in 4 seasons, and especially Cotchin, right? And I think a lot of people probably had their doubts as well about Trent Cotchin, about the type of player. Was he sort of hard enough in a way too? But I think once we saw in 2017 that not just the home and away season, but that final series and that game specifically against Geelong. I still remember, I think he spun out of a pack from about 40, 45 metres out and barreled it straight through the middle. And that pretty much typified one of his many outstanding plays during his career, and more just his leadership and courage in the cold face of play, which really stood out. And he's only just, I think, gained more plaudits and more recognition from those outside the Richmond Football Club for the legendary footballer he is, and arguably one of Richmond's all-time greats too, and also alongside Jack Riewoldt. Those two just epitomise yellow and black and the spirit of what Richmond embodies as a club, and I think it was a fitting way too. It's been, a season that I think all Richmond fans didn't hope for in a way too, considering there were quite lofty aspirations for potentially a top 4 finish. I had them finishing 5th this season, so it was way off the mark there. So it's the unknown, I think, heading into next season too for the Tigers, Brody, in 2024 is where they're going to finish to and exactly where their list is at. Yeah,
I think there was about probably 7 or 8 teams you could have put in that category from that 5th to 12th, and the Tigers were one of them. You can look at Fremantle, they're going to be in the bottom end of that scale. I know a few even thought Port Adelaide might have been in that 5th to 12th category as well, and they've gone the other way. But another good performance by Nick Lark. He kicked 6 of North Melbourne's 10 goals. Imagine what he'd be doing in a side like a Collingwood or like a Brisbane or like a Melbourne or Port Adelaide, where he's getting the delivery and he's getting those more shots on goal, because once he's in front of the sticks, mate, he just doesn't miss.
No, he's one of the best set shots components in the game that we currently have, I think, too, Brody. And I remember this was probably 11 years ago, and Chris Main, of course, the former Fremantle Docker and Collingwood Magpie. There was that season alone. I think he by memory, he converted 84% of his set shots. He was an absolutely dead eye in front of the sticks. And that's pretty much what he is replicating this season, Brody, Nick Larkey. And it's just incredible, right? And we think of some of the legendary players of our game as well who have kicked over 500 goals. Matthew Richardson was one, but he was arguably one of the worst set shots in the game. And
he could have kicked 1,500 if he kicked straight, Richard.
Yeah, if all those other 750 behinds and how many out of bounds on the fools and he have converted straight through to sticks, I think it'll be a far different story. But yet again, he's really stood well under fire once more this season, Brody, considering the limited supply that the team has given him as a whole too, and just trying to will himself into games where things haven't been in North's favour. So, again, full credit to Nick Larkin. I think, we'll see where it all goes again for North next season as well and what they can do in the upcoming draft in late November just to keep building more of those younger pieces. And hopefully sooner than later there's going to be rosy green pastures at Arden Street.
I think it will once Harley Reid gets there in September or November or whenever it is. Now, next game, Carlton 91 defeated Gold Coast 87. And you and I talked about this and we said, this just seems like a game that Carlton are going to lose. Like they build you up and then they let you down. It looked like it was going to happen, but it took an absolute masterclass from Charlie Curnow to turn things around, didn't it?
Oh, wow. I was watching this game. I thought to myself, down 7-6-48 to 1-2-8. We're 5 minutes into the second quarter. I thought, oh no, surely this is another slip where Carlton, unfortunately, every time they've travelled to the Gold Coast, there's always seems to be something instilled at Heritage Bank Stadium. I don't know whether they've stuck a haunted house somewhere or somewhere where you find at the various rural shows around the country, but that's what it seemed to be at that early stage. And it was just that lift of intensity from Charlie Curnow's goal, and it was Carlton's second major at the time, which galvanised the outfit, and they were able to spur on that momentum, spur on the incredible tackling pressure which they've displayed for the last 9 weeks, Brody, which really came to a fore once more. And they're able to win their fair share of contested ball. And although Patrick Cripps he was solid once more again, but just the other contributors we had too, Paddy Dow was solid, and George Hewitt
Nick Newman and George Hewitt, the unsung heroes over this run for me. That is week in, week out. You know what you're going to get from those two compared to some other players. And you look at like Western Bulldogs year in 2016, they had so many of those guys who they were role players. And no matter where some weeks they might get 10 or 15 possessions, but their players wouldn't get a touch. The next week they're getting 30 and being close to best on ground. And Nick Newman and George Hewitt sum that up perfectly for me. Well,
I believe, Brody, and I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago, so you can read some of my 5 talking points as well on my LinkedIn too. So I wrote after that Melbourne game, and so the days after it, about George Hewitt should be in Carlton's best 22. He was in there last season. Of course, this season had its fair shares of ups and downs. He had that broken hand as well, missed the round 3 game against GWS, if I'm not mistaken. Then he was the sub in round 10 against Collingwood, came on, I think, late in our third quarter. He gets knocked out in a tackle the following week against Sydney, misses 3 weeks of footy, comes back in round 16 against Hawthorn, comes on as a sub, same the following week against Fremantle, and then the door opens up again because Matt Kennedy does his MCL in the tackle during, I think it was midway through our third quarter against Fremantle. And again, everyone says, cliche and cliche, the opportunities open up where a player gets injured and you can take that moment alone and make it your own. And that's exactly what he did. And I think it's not just the amount of disposals and accumulation effect that he's having, Brody. It's his composure under pressure. We saw against Melbourne 2 weeks ago, right? Remember, it was the last 15 seconds of the game. He could have easily booted that ball straight down to touch. It would have been paid deliberate once more. The players would have known how long there was left, probably, unless you're the manager of either side showing up the board saying, oh, there's only 15, 20 seconds left. But his composure in that play alone, Brody, is something that really stood out. And again, he just embodies what Carlton, the reason why the Blues brought him 2 years ago to partner alongside Patrick Cripps, to have that extra big-bodied midfielder to supply clearances and contested ball. And I truly believe, Brody, that he's part of their best 22 for mine.
Oh, easily for me. I'd actually probably consider him in the top 15 who I'd be picking, especially come finals when it's a higher pressure game. But I talked about this with Spider on another podcast during the week. And I said, when it comes to finals and grand finals, it's not your top 6 players that win your premierships. You know what you're going to get from your superstars. It's your players who probably your 16 to 22, you know, who might start on a bench or who might be a back pocketer, who might be a forward pocketer. And you go back in history and some of the best performances, the one that springs to mind straight away, Lewis Roberts-Thompson. Back pocketer, unassuming, probably should have won a Norm Smith medal. I still think he's robbed to this day when Chris Judd won it in the losing one. It's your bottom 16 to 22 players that play a role on grand final day that really get you over the line.
Oh, definitely for sure, Brody. And you nailed down the head too. And he was an absolute consummate professional, Lewis Roberts-Thompson. I still remember there was that. So the 2012 game against Essendon, and he played as a forward, and they sort of just swung him around in various roles. And it was something that he always did without minimal fuss. And it didn't matter whether back to the time Coach Paul Roos or John Longmire wanted to play down back or down forward. He always seemed to accept the mantle and just take it on no matter what. So I think it's something that really embodied. And of course, we saw in the Dogs 2016 premiership year, right? Josh Dunkley was basically at that stage, he was in their 16 to 22 category of players, and Caleb Daniel at the time, and those young 20 and 19-year-olds, they were just finding their way in the AFL system. So again, I think every team talks about this alone too, and maybe that's where, of course, the match differential is between the top sides, where every one of the 23 players that comes onto the field, including the sub, does their role, and that's where the teams that sort of sit, say, middle tier to bottom tier, where it's always left up to the top 5, 6, 7 players, and then the drop-off is drastic. So, again, that's where I think the Blues have really... That's been the lift in the last 9 weeks, and the Western Bulldogs, where I think both of us had penciled as a top 4 prospect, have just completely tailed off in the last 6 to 7 weeks.
Now on the head there, Juri. Now, next game, GWS 162, defeating Essendon 36. And I tell you what, Brad Scott is one of the luckiest men in the AFL with the Crows debacle that's happened, with Dimmer signing, with Western Bulldogs, because hardly any talk is being about Essendon's performance when it really should be, because that was absolutely despicable. Well done to GWS, but seriously, Essendon, that was if you were an Essendon Bomber supporter, you'd be so disappointed right now.
Yeah, I was watching that first half, Brody, and it was pretty glaringly early on. I think they just couldn't match it with the Giants for leg speed. That orange tsunami that's back once more, and I think just seeing how lethargic they were, that was something that really stood out. And again, they just cut them to ribbons, the Giants, and they were just Jesse Hogan tearing Brandon Zerk Thatcher apart for I think it was 8 or 9 majors, and just it steadily got worse. And you think again, and I wrote this on my 5 talking points this week, you can check on my Substack or LinkedIn. I basically put as the headline, Bombers Crash Landing, because this is the first time this season, right, where they've been
blown out, very
non-competitive. Yeah, and it's just so hard to process overall that what Brad Scott has brought to the club for the first 15, 16 rounds. The Bombers were inside the top 6 for points ladder. I think it was 82.8 points they only conceded. And since then, it's been about 104, 105 points.
Yeah.
And that's where the tailoring off has been so significant, and one where I think he spoke about after, I think it was the Geelong game, after they were pants by to the tune of 77 points down at Cardinia Park in round 18, where he said, I think the players look tired and fatigued, and you're just hovering over those 2 words and you think to yourself, that's a pretty alarming comment to make as a coach when the players are starting to feel the pinch. And I think that's what's really correlated in the last month. We've seen them barely scrape over the line against West Coast and North Melbourne, and this has been ultimately the backbreaker for the Bombers, just being blown apart by the Giants, who of course had so much to play for. And I think Essendon too at least had some incentive to play for, but that's ultimately been quashed now of any hope of featuring in finals football, which we would have said after that round 17 win over Adelaide, Brody. So again, the disposal differential was, that was vast, and
that was huge,
significant. And they just the whole giant spread of contributors that they had. And I think again for Essendon, that's where they need that extra tall, big body midfield as well. They really miss Will Setterfield as well, who, of course, was still rehabbing that foot injury. I think came back through to VFL. So I think it's something they have to look at during the off-season as well. Just getting a bit more of those taller, big body midfielders to really help the likes of Zach Merritt and Darcy Parish and the rest as well. Nick Martin's had an outstanding season, but they just need that little bit more through the middle.
Yeah, for me, There's one guy I want to touch on, and that's Jake Stringer. Now, there's been people coming out within Essendon saying, yeah, he's been playing when he hasn't been fit. Why play someone like Jake Stringer when he's not fit? Because he's having no influence on the game at all. And we know how bad his body is. Why not give him 4 weeks, get your body into shape, don't play? Because a fully fit Jake Stringer is one of the best players in the comp. We all know that. We all know what he can do when he's fully fit. So for me, I look at it and go, well, what's Jake Stringer giving you at 50% that someone who's playing in the VFL couldn't give you at 100%? Because when Jake Stringer comes back at 110, look, because we know when he's up and about, he's as good as, he's like a Dusty Martin. He'll change a game in 5 minutes. Why would you bring him on as a sub? Why? I mean, this late in the season, you'd be better off playing someone, just say, right, you need to go and get surgery. You need to go and do whatever. Do that now. So then when day one of preseason, you're coming back with the under 21s, you're coming back then and starting because you're getting paid this. Probably close to, I reckon, the highest contract of the club, maybe other than Zach Merritt, and who knows what's going to happen with Darcy Parish. To be on that much money and playing half-fit football, it's just not good enough for me.
I think it's going to be a big thing, right, too, Brody. And I think having a big preseason, just getting his body right, because, and it's like that for any footballer too, Brody, that if you're only at 50, 60, 70, 75, 80%, you're not going to perform to your optimum peak. And I think we've seen that this season. We saw against the Giants in round 4 where he was arguably the difference in that game. 4 goals, 6 that afternoon, kicked that massive, well, I'll use the Mark Howell term, Sunday Easter barrel, when the game was on the line at that stage, and he stepped up. So we've seen it time and time again, and we still just hope that once he can just get his conditioning back right as well, just get whatever the surgery done and dusted, and just be ready and fit and firing for 2024, because we still always believe he's still got his best footy left in him, Brody. He's 29, doesn't turn 30 until April 25 next year. So, again, I think this is going to be a real big curve going into the off-season for him as well, and I think for the club as a whole too. So, again, we sort of have our fingers crossed and wish nothing but the best for Jake too, because we know the talent that he's got, but it's always the hard work behind the scenes that makes a difference.
Yeah. Now, this game here, St Kilda 88 defeating Geelong 55. Didn't think I'd be saying this, but Geelong cannot make the finals. Wow.
Yeah, wow-wee, isn't it, Brody? Just to phrase the Brian Taylor term. And
boy, oh boy.
Yeah, boy, oh boy, wow-wee. And I think it was pretty evident as with the Giants and Bombers game too, that St Kilda's run through the middle, and Jack Sinclair, I wrote about him too on the 5 talking points this week. He's just been stupendous. 38 disposals, 547 metres gained, and his run and carry all night just carved the Cats up, when I think we really saw the difference in leg speed between the two teams. And I think Geelong just looked really lethargic, and they just couldn't get that penetration, their game going. And Dangerfield willed himself as he could, as he did against Collingwood the previous week, but didn't quite see him just have the normal burst of speed that we saw only a couple of Friday nights ago against the Magpies. And I think that's where Geelong heading into next season as well, just going to have to just try and just rejuvenate a little bit as well, and try and get a bit more zest and speed through that midfield. And hopefully, we don't know how long it's going to be until they're back in contention. And of course, it's Geelong, and we can never discount them out of the picture. But as for St Kilda as well, they've really defied the doubters in a way too, especially this last month, right, where I think the majority had them slipping outside the 8. They had a tough schedules to run home, and I think likewise too. But again, when they play, I'll probably backtrack a little bit, but when they're defensive football, it's always got to hold up, Brody. You can't pinpoint that out. The other part too was always going to be the scoring. But when they do make it a very tight and congested game, and then they're able to break away, that's when they're damaging best. And I think we've seen those ingredients marinate in this past month, and come final football, I think it should hold them in good stead. I don't see the issue why their best footy can't match up in a way too. We've seen Rowan Marshall the last 6, 7, 8 weeks.
He's been unbelievable.
Just transcended, and he's already been heraldly underrated by, well, I don't know how many in terms of within the AFL depths, but he's always been one of St Kilda's top 5 performers week in, week out. And we see Jack Steele, of course, bounce back in the last couple of weeks after he had arguably his quietest game against Carlton, when I think he was going head-to-head with Patrick Cripps, and he only had 11 disposals that afternoon. So, again, they've got everything clicking at this stage too, and even some there guys that are a little bit unheralded in the way too. And I think Mitch Owens is going to be one of those front runners for the NAB Rising Star Award this season too. We've seen Cooper Sharman plays roll up forward, and they've just got a great spread of contributors just at the right time, Brody.
Yeah, look, with St Kilda, I had a real close look at the way that they lined up in the midfield, and it's the perfect blend of inside beasts, but also at the same time, really good ball users on the outside. So you look at Mason Wood, and 3 years ago, he was just about done in the AFL system. St Kilda threw him a lifeline, and look what he's doing. He's probably going to be picked in the All-Australian squad. Whether he's going to make the side or not, obviously Josh Dacos and Errol Goulden probably going to take those wing spots, but his first 6 weeks was just simply outstanding. Bit of a lull period, and then his last 3 or 4 have been really good again. Jack Sinclair, obviously speed and ball use, but then you got the inside balls, Jack Steele, Brad Crouch as well, and then Rowan Marshall can also play like an inside midfielder once the ball hits the ground. Just loves to tackle, and their pressure, like you said, is really going to hold up well in finals, and I don't see him coming to finals and it being a blowout just with the way that they play, and we all know what Ross can do. And I was going to ask you this question a bit later, but I'm going to put it to you now. Coach of the year, Ross Lyon, Kingsley, or Craig McRae?
Well, I've got Kingsley for mine too, Brody, just because the position that's the Giants were in last season alone, and that plays a differentiating role, shall I say, in terms of what does judge as a coach of the year in terms of the criteria, and considering what he's done with basically the same group of players that Leon Cameron had for whatever the handful of seasons he was in charge of. But for him just to come in there, have a fresh perspective, a fresh set of eyes, a new game plan, and a game plan which I thoroughly believe resonates, that dare and flair that the Giants within their identity, within the playing group have. And I think it suits to their strengths as well. Once they're able to break the chains and get on the outside and run rampant through the middle, it suits them well. And too, with the intercept marking, which they were renowned for too during those years when they were contending for a premiership, that's back again. And I think what he's done in that embodiment of work alone to get a team that only won, 6 games last year into a team that has 12 wins currently. And if they will beat Carlton this Sunday, they'll assure themselves of a final spot, and that the Bulldogs lose to Geelong, they'll have 13 wins. So that's basically, they've already got double the wins from last season. So I can't fault whatsoever that Kingsley will be getting the Coach of the Year award for mine. And Ross Lyon has done incredible things at St Kilda this season. We saw it when he first took over, I think, in 2007 as well. And, of course, they narrowly missed finals that year. And then to get them to a prelim final the following year, grand final in 09 and 010, yeah, he's done an excellent job. But we look from just that one season alone to where the Giants are at now, Brody, that's where the definitive Coach of the Year award goes to Adam Kingsley for mine. Yep,
I agree with you. I would also nearly put Kenny Hinkley up there too with what he's done with that port list this year. I know that they've always had that, but if you judge last year's performance compared to this year's with all the external pressure, I think that also counts for a fair bit. Now, the game that everyone's been talking about here in South Australia, you can't go outside without someone bailing you up about this at the moment. It was Sydney 74 defeating Adelaide 73.
The Crows were robbed right in front of me. Right in front of me.
That's literally what's going around South Australia right now, and it's hard to argue with that, Juri.
Oh, extremely hard to look away from that, Brody. And again, I wrote in that piece, the diabolical non-goal review. We've seen it for 4 or 5 years where teams have ultimately been robbed of a game, and it's just... this is not a new story whatsoever, Brody. We've seen it time and time again. It is glaring. You only have to read through articles from 2018 and 2019 to figure out that teams have been on the raw end of the stick, and that's exactly what happened to the Crows on Saturday night. My dad and I were watching the final 8 minutes of that game, and we thought initially first, it must have grazed the post or something at the time. But then you look at once more the numerous replays that came up. You mentioned off-air before we started today's podcast about the best view that was there was an Adelaide Crows fan holding a Nokia phone, recording the goal, and you could see daylight between the padding and the ball going through the big sticks. And that's all that needs to tell you. And then, of course, we see the CEO come out and basically issue an apology once more. But we've seen apologies over and over again, but apologies that have led to no initiation of taking the next steps of what do we do in terms of revamping up the scoreboard or doing what the NRL and the NFL and the other sporting codes, including tennis, have been doing for a long time, and improving technology to a point where we don't have these black and white grey areas anymore, Brody. And that's the issue where I think during this off-season, this is a big summer project whatsoever for the AFL to get right, because we don't want to see come, say, a grand final this year or semi-final or qualifying final or prelim final, that there is a period of time, say in the last minute and 30 to 2 minutes of the game, where the game says 3 or 4 points, the differential, and the team ultimately is on the receiving end of a bad call because the ball clearly went through the sticks, and then they ultimately didn't decide, say, the goal umpire to take it up to the scoreboard, like what happened on Saturday night in the Crows-Swans clash. We don't want to see that happen yet again. And ultimately, that does come down to the goal umpire as well. You can't make straightforward, blunderous errors, which ultimately cop the bad end of the stick.
When the technology is there, you have to use it. If you're not 100% sure, with 2 minutes to go or a minute to go, what's the harm in doing it? Like, you have nothing to lose. You have nothing to gain and everything to lose by not doing it.
And absolutely spot on again, Brody. And I think we almost resonate back to Siren Gate of 2006, round 5 down in Launceston between St Kilda and Fremantle, where I think
Chris Connolly came out swinging, didn't he?
Yeah. Oh, he did. He came barnstorming out of the coach's box and ready to have his fist up to the umpires. But we look at that time. I'm pretty sure Matthew Nichols was umpiring that game.
Yeah,
I still remember clearly watching the vision, and at the time, I think the umpires were in a state of confusion, and whether they heard the siren or whether the siren was too quiet to hear at the time. And it's that same debacle that has really been a glaring issue. And again, I'll summarise this all up. They've got to make big initiatives to get this right, because we can't see megapixels in, say, 360p or 480p back to the early 2010s. This is 2023 now. We need to see HD quality that's up to 12K megapixels. So it's just the finest, tuniest details, Brody, to make sure that we don't see any more of these howler calls.
Especially when there's a score involved. I think that's the main thing. There's always going to be a human error when it comes to field umpiring. We know that. And I think most supporters understand that. Some week you're on the good end, some weeks you're on the bad ends. But when there's scores involved, that's where we need to be able to look at it and say, right, definitive goal, definitive point. Because that's what people's going to talk about. And that's what's probably put a sour taste in everyone's mouth on what's been a fantastic season so far. But you and I could talk about this the whole episode, but we better move on, mate. West Coast 92 defeating Western Bulldogs 85. And the silence in that final quarter when the Bulldogs fans realised, wow, we're going to lose this. It was just eerie in that stadium.
Didn't you have sort of warning signs early, Brody, that when West Coast kicked 5 of the first 6 goals, that they weren't going to fly away into the abyss? That's what I thought right away. When I tuned it on later in the first quarter, I almost had to blink a couple of times just to read the scoreboard. It was 33-13. I was thinking, okay, this is going to be a lot closer. They're not going to buckle down no matter whether the Bulldogs get back in the contest, ultimately, which they did. And I think they hit the lead early in the third quarter and thought, well, they're just going to bark away and get the all-important 4 points. But that didn't happen. And I think it's always those ones, Brody. It doesn't matter whether a team, say, is fighting for a top 8 spot or there's a team, say, West Coast, who are now second last on the ladder. You give them just that tiniest, whiffiest sniff of giving themselves every shot of winning a game, and they'll seize it with both hands. And that's exactly what the Eagles did. And their veterans stepped up again, and Jamie Cripps, he was sensational, the 5 goals in the game. And ultimately, should Paul Brownlow votes come Brownlow night on Monday, September 25th, he played an integral part in West Coast getting those 4 points.
I gave him 1. I gave Tim Kelly the 3. I thought when the game was there on the line early, had to give Tim Kelly the 3. Went Bontempelli 2 for just single-handedly trying to drag his team over the line. Then Cripps, obviously, with the 5 goals with 1. And Cripps' career, I actually looked at it. He's one of the most underrated forwards for such a long period. I didn't realise how many goals he's kicked. It's just simply outstanding.
Yeah, I don't know why the reason why he doesn't get talked about too much and the recognition that he thoroughly deserves, Brody, too. Considering everything he applies from being that pressure forward as well, a guy just tackles his heart out every game. And those are the very sort of you push it aside and maybe unknowns, intangibles with players that seem to fly under the radar, and he always brings that. And I think since he's been at West Coast, I think he departed St Kilda, I think it was at the end of 2011 or 2012, around that time.
2012, yeah.
Yeah, around that time. So he was only, 20, turning 21 when he entered the West Coast Eagles in 2013. And right from there, he basically established himself in West Coast Best 22 and is only just sort of transcended his game to the point where he played that big part in West Coast 2018 Premiership flag. And he deserves more credit than what he's actually been minimally given, I think, Brody. And it really stood out on Sunday too when the veterans gave him that spark and when they ultimately needed it late in the game as well. He kicked that very important goal to put West Coast 15 points clear, and it basically really, I think, epitomised the West Coast will and want that afternoon, only last Sunday. And as for the Bulldogs, it was, wow, where to? And it just, I think it was pretty glaring. And when they had the ball in hand, they looked really shaky and looked very fumbly, and they weren't hitting their targets as they normally do. And I think the running waves, which when they do get up and running, was very non-existent at the best of times. And you can't leave all your eggs on Marcus Bontempelli to do all the spade work. 32 disposals, 21 of them contested. Yeah. He had 12 clearances and 10 tackles and a goal. And
I think it's gone to show the importance of Libba this year. When Libba's out, when Libba went off last week, you saw immediately around the clearances, they just got smashed by Hawthorn. This week, no Libba as well. Bontempelli's left doing the things. You don't need your stars going in there, doing the dirty work. You'd much rather Bontempelli on the outside hitting up your forwards. And that's what Libba does best. Libba will stir things up. Libba will get the blood flowing. He's the spiritual leader of the Western Bulldogs. Saw when he went off last week, saw this week. They just didn't have heart. And for me, that's exactly what Libba brings week in, week out. But I'm going to move on to the Melbourne game now, mate. Melbourne 87 defeating Hawthorn 60. And there was one comment in the press conference that really caught my eye about this, and that was Simon Goodwin on Finn McGuinness. And he come out and he said he doesn't really like the way Finn McGuinness plays. He's only there to stop his opponent. He doesn't chase the ball himself. Now, he kept Clayton Oliver to 14 disposals. Finn McGuinness got 13 himself. So right away, that's pretty factually incorrect. And if you were to tell me that Simon Goodwin wouldn't love a Finn McGuinness in his side come finals time to chuck on a Nick Dacos in that first final, I'm telling you, you're stupid.
Yeah, that was a pretty sort of out in there comment, I think, too, Brody. And Melbourne do have a target there, but he's not in their best 22. And we spoke about this for, I think, last week's episode, James Harms.
Yeah,
he's been on the fringes this season. He's played the tagger's role for Melbourne. So I find it very contradictory in a way, too, just on that comment alone, that you take a pot shot at Finn McGuinness, because we've seen taggers over the years, even Ryan Crowley, right? And that North Melbourne game, right, back in, I think it was round 13, 2013, it was a Sunday afternoon here at now the defunct Subiaco Oval, where Boomer Harvey, I think, lost his cool at one point, and to the point where I think he had, I think it was something like 9 or 10 touches that afternoon. It was an incredible day just to see. And of course, Crowley had claimed so many scalps, but I think the frustration, of course, just manifested itself not just from Oliver having such limited effect on the game with only 14 disposals, but all the way through to the press conference. But that's where I think teams sort of have gone away from the tagger, but the tagger always has a role. Every one of the 23 players has a role on the team, Brody, week in, week out.
Yep, and Sam Mitchell spoke about this really well in the press conference. He said the best thing about our great game is there's spots for taggers, there's spots for big men, there's spots for 170 centimetre players, there's spots for tall, small, big, little. That's the best thing about AFL. There's a spot for everyone, regardless. If you've got drive, if you've got will, you can make it in the AFL. And I thought, right, well done, Sam Mitchell. He's probably copped tag, or all his probably career, I reckon he would have copped a tag, and he would have got up probably a little bit aggressive with Ryan Crowley, like everyone else did over the years. But I mean, that's footy. You deal with it, you move on. Yeah, definitely, for sure. And that's when you get that superstar status, Brody, too. As a midfielder, when you build yourself to being one of the elite midfielders in the league, that you're ultimately going to cop the sheer amount of attention in a way that you can't shrug off, and you can make complaints to the AFL board and say, well, can we crack down on taggers grappling shirts and sort of putting their backs behind the play just to focus on their opponent. But what McGuinness has done, right, is that he's kept close checking
tabs.
Yeah.
And that's something that was really evident on Sunday too, watching around the stoppages, that he wasn't just grappling Oliver by the jumper. He was actually going with him step for step. And that's where I think within the tight congestion that we didn't see Oliver have that impact. And that's the role of the tagger. And that is what they're out there to do, and out there to do it fairly and to do a point where, of course, it's going to draw the eye of coaches, because that's where they do.
Yeah, bring back the tagger, definitely, in my opinion. Now, final game of the round, it was Port Adelaide 74, defeating Fremantle 58. High pressure game, this one. Not always pretty to watch, but it was a Port midfield that was really the difference. Probably even in clearances, but Rosie, Butters, Horn, Francis, their disposal so much more effective than Sarong and Brayshaw for me.
Spot on, nail on the head there, Brody, too. Just, I think when the Dockers did charge in that last quarter as well, they really lacked that composure going inside 50. I think they spun Brendan Cox down forward for the last 9 minutes of the game. He did kick that goal just to give them a flickering glimmer of hope. But again, I think just around the coalface and on the outside as well, that's where the class between the two teams was a significant difference. And we've seen that over the course of this season with Port Adelaide, where you can get into the hands of Jason Horn-Francis, and I think he only had 14 or 15 touches, but every one of those disposals was so lethal and damaging that it basically led to not only just score involvements, but score assists. And of course, with Zach Butters, and he was basically influential right from the opening quarter. I think he finished with 33 or 34 disposals in the game. And Connor Rosie, I think, had similarly the same amount. So it was those guys once more that stepped up to the fore and made the major contributing difference too. And I think for Fremantle as well, gave it their all, and they've been doing that for the last 3 weeks. And we spoke about last week too, that they've got a game plan at least they've been building. And of course, maybe wish we have seen it early this season, that it can stack up in a way too. And I think Longmuir was pretty candid about it too, probably for the last couple of weeks as well, that those losses that we did have during the off-season as well, Blake Acres, Darcy Tucker, Rory Lobb, all moving interstate. And of course, the retirement of David Mundy really did hurt in terms of the experience point of view. So look for some little bit of rejigging, I think, for the Dockers, and just to build on having more experience as well, and having a game plan which they can stick with consistently and that can match it with the best in 2024 for mine.
That sounds good. And what we're going to do now, going to break it up before we get into this week's matches. And I've got a list of players here, Juri, and I want you to tell me whether they're going to stay or whether they should be traded. All right? Or whether you think they're going to go. Going to kick it off. Sean Darcy.
I think he'll stay at Fremantle for mine. I just believe the body of work him and Luke Jackson have done this season as a tandem can work in the future anyway. With Darcy, we spoke about, needs to further enhance on his forward craft, and he has the potential to do so. We've seen Jackson do it this season, but I just believe their complementary mix together provides a different dimension I think Fremantle haven't had in their ruck for a long period of time. So I definitely see him recommitting pen to paper for mine. And I think it'd be great for Fremantle because they've already got that young nucleus already there that's ready to, hopefully for Fremantle Dockers as well, jump back into the finals next season.
Darcy Parish.
That's a tough one, right, Brody? That's
very tough.
I feel it's line ball in a way, but I feel as though he'll recommit. I think that's my go-to. And he's been in the club for, 8 seasons now. He's seen the best and worst at times as well. And what they're doing under Brad Scott and him being held to account as well on the defensive side, I think that's where the area where I think he has been found out, but I think that's an area where he can work on. And I think that is a sort of a tangible area where every player can work on a deficiency that they have. And that's one of them, I believe, he can do and do well to effect. And I think what they've already got through midfield as well with Ben Hobbs and Nick Martin, and we've seen Massimo D'Ambrosio flow through there at various stages. It's bright. And Archie Perkins there too, Zach Merritt, who's had another outstanding season. So, and Will Setterfield, they'll get a healthy Setterfield back next season from that foot injury. Yeah. It's a promising midfield right there, and I can't see why not he should stay at Tullamarine for mine, Brody.
I think he'll stay as well, but it's round 23. He still hasn't signed, and it's going to be on a big contract. And that's the one thing that always has me a little bit sketchy and a little bit worried. I think if it wouldn't be the biggest loss for Essendon if they could bring in maybe a top 10 pick for Darcy Parish. I think that's a win-win for the both of them. Whether that'll happen, I don't think it will, but I still think he'll recommit, but I'm a little bit worried because it's round 23 gone, still hasn't recommitted. Now, this one here, there's been no talk about it, but I think the Western Bulldogs should look at offloading him and getting a first-round pick, and that's Jack McRae.
Wow, that is one big surprising call there, Brody. And his production has dropped off in the last month, and probably not to those lofty heights that we're always known for him consistently racking up 30 disposals a game. So can I throw something at you now, Brody, with Jack McRae? Where would he send him to? Which club needs that winger which just accumulates the ball and runs all day and provides not just disposals, as we've talked about with McRae, but to damaging effect?
So I actually had a thought about this as well, and I don't see him as a winger. I see him as a clearance, I suppose, an inside clearance player. That's where he was getting his 25-30. He's been played on a wing, and I think they're wasting him on a wing. He's so clean around stoppages. So I'd be going to a young side who needs not necessarily a ball underneath, but someone who's really, really clean with their disposals under pressure. And I look at even Fremantle, and this is where I think it could be really good in a Fremantle side. I mean, if you want to keep Hayden Young on that back line, Jack McRae's disposal is really, really good. His disposal by foot and his disposal by hand, and that's where Freo really get let down. And so if you had a McRae, a Brayshaw, or a Sarong, I'm not sure what they could give up, but I was also looking Collingwood. Tom Mitchell's not going to go on forever as well. Someone like Jack McRae, his brother Finns is there at Collingwood, I believe. I think Bulldogs at the moment, they're wasting one of the best players around clearances for me.
It's a very hard call to make too, Brody, because I think we saw last season, right, when Josh Dunkley left for the Brisbane Lions and, of course, Adam Treloar leaving for Collingwood at the end of 2020. And so if they were able to fill those holes in the way too, the midfield being arguably their greatest strength of all. But now it's got to the point where, don't you think in a way at this point it is one-dimensional? I don't know whether you agree with me or not at times, because I look at their midfield and I see a blend, but then at the same time, you watch them on game day and it feels all very one-dimensional. Is that not a sort of an outward perspective on that?
Yeah, I can agree with that to an extent with the Bulldogs, but I think Jack McRae he's not being played in his best position, and I don't think he's adjusting to that wing position very well, whether that's attitude, whether that's, footy nous as well. It could be a bit of column A, bit of column B for that one. But I mean, you look at Bontempelli's always going to be in the midfield. Lib has shown he's all Australian worthy in the midfield as well. By the time you get Bailey Smith rolling through there, I think he's going to be wasted. And if they could get something, be a win-win for them and another club, I think it's probably the best option. Now, we'll move on from that one. We'll keep talking about him till the cows come home. Where does Brody Grundy end up?
That's another good question too, Brody. And ever since he was dropped, I think, was it back in round 17, if I'm not mistaken as well, the St Kilda game, and found himself on the fringes. And I think, did we touch on this last week as well about the combination Max Gawn and Braden Bruce were together for that one season?
Yeah.
And that's what it reminds me of. And no one's touched upon that whatsoever. With the mix between Gordon and Bruce and how that ultimately didn't work. And that's unfortunately what has sort of transpired in the last month between the pairing. And I think if I'm looking at it this way as well, and which club needs a ruckman, you go Geelong and Sydney. That's the first two right there. Geelong, for as many years as we can recall, haven't had a fully established number one ruckman. And although Reece Stanley's been there, he's had his assortment of injuries as well. In Sydney now, with Tom Hickey announcing his retirement only yesterday, and them needing that extra ruckman too. And of course, Hayden McLean can play in the ruck, but he's been doing so well for that. You just need that extra bit of mongrel and grunt and physical presence there in the middle. And I think that would suit perfectly with Sydney's embodiment of what they're doing at the moment and their resurgence in the last 2 months, Brody. So I see either Geelong or Sydney as my two destinations for him in 2024.
Yep. So there's some whispers down here in South Australia. Obviously, Brody Grundy, an SA boy, grew up here, and I would probably say 80% sure he's going to end up at Port Adelaide.
That wouldn't surprise me whatsoever if he moves to Alberton for mine.
And I think it's going to be, imagine telling a ruckman, say, do you want to come here and he would be back to All-Australian form. You get to ruck to Jason Horne-Francis, Connor Rozee and Zach Butters for your final 5 years of your career. You're going to look like a star. They're going to make you look like a star. I think that could be the best thing for his career because he's such a confidence player. If he gets his confidence up, those guys around him, he'll be back to his best in a heartbeat.
He had silver service on a platter too, Brody. And there's one thing I want to point out too, because they've got Scott Lice and Dante Vicentini as well in there.
Sam Hayes as well.
Yeah, Sam Hayes too as well, part of their ruck roles. And
trio.
Ruck trio, ruck tree, if you want to call it that way. So that's where the question is going to come into play too, Brody, is what happens with that squeeze if Grundy ultimately decides to return home to South Australia and play for Port Adelaide?
Yeah, I think it would allow Finlayson to play up forward as a sole forward, I think, and I think that'll be key for Port Adelaide, especially with Dixon. You don't want Dixon to be chipping in the ruck with the way his body is at the moment either. See, Vicentini you can bring in. Sam Hayes, he's actually proven a little bit over these last few weeks as well. Scotty Lycett, Scotty's an EP boy. I actually grew up playing footy against him, so shouldn't be saying too much. But, yeah, I think Scotty's struggling a little bit, to be honest. I think his body's starting to let him down and up against a real athletic ruckman. I think he gets found out a little bit just around the ground. But for me, I think Brody Grundy will be the best thing for Port Adelaide, and you don't want to be coming up against a midfield over the next 3 years with Grundy, Butters, Horne-Francis and Connor Rozee.
Absolutely. Good luck, isn't it? Just ramming it down their throats for easy clearances. And I think we've already seen what he's done since, was it 2000? So he was drafted in 2012, pretty sure pick 18. And 2014, I think it was only his first or second season, just really blossomed on the stage and has really just gone leaps and bounds. And apart from this one season of Melbourne, which he's sort of taken a step back. So hopefully, again, we say it in sort of cliche terms, there's a resolution and he finds the ideal fit for him because he's still got so much more to offer. Right?
And I think we want to see the best players playing at their best, wherever that may be. We don't care. We just want to see the best players in the AFL playing at their best, mate.
And that's spot on too. And it doesn't matter what fit as well, as long as that fit you're part of as well and you feel belonged and you feel valued and you feel looked after. And I think we said this a few minutes back. I thoroughly believe as well Sydney would be a great fit for him.
Yeah, so do I. And it's the exact same thing with that midfield, that Sydney midfield, Warner, Goulden. You could use that exact same argument for Sydney as well.
Yeah, again, they're basically in the same range as Port Adelaide with their age demographic too. They're like baby swans. We'll use that term, baby swans, baby bombers in 93, baby swans. They're only just getting a career started. They've only been, 3-4 seasons in. This is a scary enough proposition if you're 17 other clubs and you're having to contend with Sydney for the years to come. Because, of course, I think this season, right, people were sort of sweating on, they're in the premiership, sort of make a grand final. Now they're having a hangover through the first 14 rounds. But, again, no one realised this transformation of form that Sydney have been able to turn around in the last 8 to 9 weeks and ultimately lock up a final spot. So they've just done tremendous work and with a young core group, which is arguably one of the youngest in the game.
Yeah, fully agree. Let's jump into this week's games, mate. I'll ask you, similar to last week, one-word answer. Friday night, Essendon versus Collingwood MCG. Who wins?
Collingwood by 5 goals for mine, Brody.
Yep, good one word. That's right, mate.
3 words.
I'm just as bad. I'm picking the same too. Hawthorn versus Fremantle MCG.
I feel a bit pickly about this one, and I don't know why I chose this, but I chose Fremantle. I'm probably going to get bitten in the bum for this, so I'll probably leave it as well. Yeah, I'll probably leave that as that.
North Melbourne versus Gold Coast Suns, Blundstone Arena. What a way to finish off the year for North Melbourne down in Tasmania.
Well, hopefully I can at least welcome and sort of send their fans home happy with a win too, but I just see the Suns winning and equaling their career, record best 10 wins in a season.
Tell you what, if I could put my house up for sale, I would put my whole house on this one right here. There's no way North Melbourne are winning this game and potentially coughing up a chance at Harley Reid. Gold Coast Suns by a long way this weekend. Brisbane Lions versus St Kilda at the Gabba.
Brisbane for mine.
Me too. I've got a carton on that with Spider. He's back in the Saints. Geelong Cats versus Western Bulldogs, GMHBA.
I think Bulldogs for mine, Brody.
Yeah, Bulldogs for me too. They've Cats have put the queue in the rack. Half the players going off this week to get surgery, and funny what happens 1 week out of finals, and they kind of look like what they rocked up to Mad Monday in last year. They're all going to be on walking frames this Mad Monday.
Maybe it might be the same replica once again, hey, isn't it?
I reckon it will. They won't have to dress up this time though. West Coast Eagles versus Adelaide Crows, Optus Stadium. Can Tex kick a bag and snag the Coleman medal?
Adelaide should win this one, Brody, too. And I think we spoke about it. And if they have one, hadn't been for Gem, that ridiculous non-goal, I think they would have made the 8 anyway, just the way they've been tracking.
Me too. Port Adelaide versus Richmond, Adelaide Oval, Sunday, 12:30.
Port Adelaide for mine.
Me too, by a lot. I reckon Sydney Swans versus Melbourne, SCG.
Melbourne narrowly by a couple of goals.
And final game, Carlton versus GWS. This could be a mini elimination final for the Giants in this one. I reckon with Toby Green being subbed off for that last half, look out for him this weekend.
Well, I've got us winning Carlton to make it 10 in a row, and I think we should solidify that 5th spot. But I'd be pretty worried if we're playing the Giants the first week. That's all I'm going to say. So we'll see what happens in that regard too. If the Bulldogs win and we knock out the Giants and play the Bulldogs in the first week. But for some reason, over a number of years, we don't quite stack up to the Bulldogs, even though we won last year there, but ultimately lost this year's encounter in round 9. So can't wait to find out who our opponents will be in that first week. It's pretty exciting for sure.
Yeah, I think GWS are very similar to St Kilda. The way that they play, they can come out and beat anyone or at least make it close on their day. Western Bulldogs, they're that enigma though as well. They can produce a 5-goal winning performance against the top side, or they could go and get beaten by West Coast. And that's another thing you don't want to face in finals because you never know what they're going to dish up either.
No, I think we saw it last year, right, when they travelled to play Dockers here. They were 41 points up early in the second quarter, and ultimately Fremantle willed themselves back and won in arguably Fremantle's greatest ever finals victory, I'd say, apart from the 2013 qualifying final against Geelong down at Cardinia Park and the prelim final that year against Sydney here at Subiaco Oval. So, yeah, we'll see what happens in that regard too, Brody.
As a Fremantle fan, mate, it's I actually turned it off at halftime. We were at a footy presentation night, and I turned that off at halftime last year. Pretty angry, and then I just thought I'd check the score halfway through the last quarter and thought, geez, hang on, I might actually have to pay attention here. Sorry, guys, I'm leaving. I'm going to sit in the change rooms to watch the final 10 minutes.
Quick, fast and scooting on the way back home just to watch the final, 45 minutes of the game.
Exactly. No, I just sat in the change rooms with my phone. That way no one could hear me. So, it's all right. I'm used to being alone, being a Fremantle supporter, mate.
Oh, just shout the lungs out, eh? That was an incredible night last year. And just the whole emotion behind it all too, just to face that adversity and get back into it as well. And considering what the Bulldogs did in basically tearing the heart out at that point of the home crowd and sort of rejuvenating it back again, I think it was a full testament of character. And again, that's what finals always brings. It's one of those ones where it's so even to the point where you can't make the barest of mistakes, Brody.
No, you definitely can't, mate. That's about all we've got time for on this week's version of the AFL, guys. Have a listen to the other Sporting Mates podcast, the NRL show, the football show. There's plenty going on in the wider world of sports. Thanks for listening. Cheers.